Inside the world's most dangerous dam that could destroy a country, somewhere in northern Iraq, a wall of concrete and earth stretches nearly 3 miles across the Tigris River, holding back enough water to bury an entire city under 65 feet in a matter of hours. That's not a hypothetical worst-case scenario dreamed up for dramatic effect either. It's the documented, official assessment of engineers who have studied this structure closely for decades, not speculation or exaggeration invented for a headline. And here's the part that should really unsettle you. This dam hasn't been quietly stable since the day it was built. It has been actively, continuously failing, in a very real and measurable sense, for almost 40 years, and the only thing standing between that failure and a humanitarian catastrophe is a crew of workers who never really stop working. This is the story of Mosul Dam, and understanding why it's still standing today is almost more frightening than understanding how it could fail. It's a story with no clean resolution, no single moment of triumph or disaster to point to, just an unbroken 40-year stretch of quiet, grinding effort, standing between an entire river valley and catastrophe. To understand how something this dangerous ever got built in the first place, you have to go back to Iraq in the early 1980s. Saddam Hussein's government was pushing hard to modernize the country's infrastructure, and a massive new dam on the Tigris River was near the top of the list, promising hydroelectric power, irrigation water for agriculture, and a powerful symbol of national engineering ambition. Swiss engineers handled the design, and a German-Italian construction consortium was brought in to build it, working under considerable political pressure to deliver a landmark project on schedule. Construction moved forward through the early 1980s, and by 1984, the dam, originally named after Saddam himself, was operational. Choosing this particular stretch of the Tigris River wasn't arbitrary either. Engineers needed a location with enough elevation change and geological structure to support a reservoir of the size Iraq's planners had in mind, and the site north of Mosul appeared to offer exactly that on paper, close enough to the city to serve its growing population and agricultural land, yet positioned within a valley that seemed to promise a stable enough foundation for a project of this magnitude. Site surveys were conducted, as they are for any major dam project, but the political timeline driving construction left less room than engineers might have wanted for the kind of exhaustive, multi-year geological investigation a structure this consequential really demanded. The sort of investigation that, in hindsight, almost certainly would have flagged the dissolving bedrock long before a single ton of concrete was poured. The scale of what they built was genuinely staggering. The completed structure stretched roughly 2.8 miles across the Tigris River Valley, rising 375 feet above the riverbed, making it Iraq's largest dam by a considerable margin. Behind it, the reservoir held back something in the range of 11 cubic kilometers of water, an amount almost impossible to picture in ordinary terms, roughly equivalent to filling more than 4 million Olympic swimming pools with water, and stacking that volume behind a single structure. To put that in perspective, imagine a lake large enough to completely submerge a major city under water dozens of feet deep, all held in place by a single structure spanning the width of the valley. For a country working to establish itself as a modern industrial power, Mosul Dam represented exactly the kind of ambitious, headline-grabbing project that governments love to point to as proof of progress. Picture standing at the base of the structure and looking straight up at a wall of concrete and earth, taller than most 30-story buildings, stretching so far to either side that the far ends disappear from view entirely. Behind that wall sits a body of water large enough that, if released all at once, it could plausibly rival some of history's worst natural flood disasters. Except this one would be entirely artificial, sitting directly above a heavily populated river valley by deliberate design rather than accident of geography. But almost immediately, the ground beneath that ambition turned out to be a serious problem, in the most literal sense possible. Not long after the dam became operational, engineers realized that the entire foundation sat on a layer of gypsum and karst limestone, a type of bedrock that is naturally soluble in water. This wasn't a minor geological quirk. It meant that the rock the dam's entire foundation rested on was, quite literally, dissolving, slowly but continuously, wherever water came into contact with it. By 1986, water had already begun seeping through gaps forming in that foundation, an unmistakable sign that the geological problems were considerably worse than the original site surveys had predicted. This was the kind of flaw that doesn't announce itself with a dramatic crack or a visible collapse. It just quietly, patiently eats away at the one thing the entire dam depends on to stay standing. What makes gypsum and karst bedrock particularly treacherous compared to more conventional foundation problems is that the dissolving process doesn't happen uniformly or predictably. Water finds the path of least resistance through the rock, carving out hidden channels and cavities that can grow for months or years before any visible sign appears on the surface above. Engineers studying the site later described discovering sinkholes forming downstream of the dam, physical evidence of underground caverns that had already grown large enough to cause the ground above them to collapse inward, an unsettling reminder that the real damage was always happening somewhere unseen, well beneath anything a routine visual inspection could catch. Faced with a foundation that was actively dissolving beneath one of the country's most critical pieces of infrastructure, Iraqi engineers came up with the only solution available to them: a continuous grouting program. Workers drill boreholes down into the foundation rock and pump in a thick mixture of cement, sand, bentonite clay, and water, designed to fill the voids forming underground before they grow large enough to threaten the structure's stability. This isn't a one-time repair. It has run, in some form, nearly around the clock since the mid-1980s, because the moment crews stop injecting grout, flowing water resumes dissolving the rock, undoing whatever progress had been made. Over the decades, workers have pumped an estimated 95,000 tons of grout material into the ground beneath this dam, an almost unbelievable figure for a fix that was never actually meant to be permanent. It's less a repair than a permanent, unwinnable negotiation with geology itself, one that has to be renewed literally every single day the dam continues to hold water. Inside the facility, this work looks almost mundane from the outside, more like an industrial factory operation than a dramatic race against catastrophe. Drilling rigs mounted on the dam's crest bore down through the structure into the foundation rock below, guided by decades of accumulated data about exactly where the worst voids tend to form. Technicians mix the grout in precise ratios, adjusting the formula depending on how quickly water is flowing through a particular section and how large the cavity being filled appears to be, drawing on decades of institutional knowledge about which sections of the foundation tend to demand attention most urgently. It's methodical, repetitive, unglamorous work, the kind that rarely makes headlines precisely because, when it's going well, absolutely nothing dramatic happens at all. That, in a strange way, is the entire point. Success here looks identical to an ordinary day. For decades, that grinding, invisible maintenance effort managed to keep pace with the problem, more or less. Then, in the summer of 2014, everything about that fragile balance changed almost overnight. As the Islamic State swept through large portions of northern Iraq that year, seizing cities and territory with alarming speed, Mosul Dam itself fell under militant control in August 2014. For more than a week, nobody outside the group holding the facility knew exactly what was happening inside, or whether the grouting operations that the dam's survival depended on were continuing at all. International observers watched with genuine alarm, aware that a structure this fragile, left entirely without maintenance for even a relatively short window, could begin deteriorating in ways that might not become apparent until it was far too late to reverse. There was no way to send inspectors in during the occupation, no way to confirm whether drilling rigs sat idle, or whether the delicate daily rhythm of monitoring and injection had simply stopped. It was, for that stretch of time, a genuine unknown, sitting directly above more than 1 million lives. Iraqi and coalition forces eventually recaptured the dam, but the crisis didn't simply end there. In the months that followed recapture, maintenance work still failed to resume at anything close to full capacity because the workers who ran the grouting program hadn't been paid in months, and the surrounding region remained far too dangerous for the kind of sustained, specialized labor the dam required, and international contractors who might otherwise have stepped in were understandably reluctant to send personnel into an active conflict zone. The structure sat in a dangerous limbo, neither actively collapsing nor being properly maintained, for a stretch of time that alarmed engineers watching from outside the country. That gap in maintenance is exactly what pushed the situation from a long-term concern into an active international emergency. In February 2016, the US Embassy in Baghdad issued a stark public warning based on assessments from the US Army Corps of Engineers describing the dam as facing what it called an unprecedented risk of catastrophic failure with little warning. According to that same assessment, a failure would send what officials described as an inland tidal wave rushing south along the Tigris River. The city of Mosul, roughly 35 miles downstream, would flood within about 4 hours. The wave would continue on toward Baghdad, arriving roughly 45 hours after a breach. The embassy's own estimate placed potential deaths somewhere between 500,000 and 1.47 million people, an almost incomprehensible range for a single infrastructure failure, and it explicitly advised American citizens in the country to be prepared to evacuate if the dam showed signs of imminent collapse. The language in that assessment was unusually blunt for an official diplomatic communication, avoiding the kind of hedged, cautious phrasing governments typically use when discussing infrastructure risk. Officials wanted the severity of the situation understood clearly, without ambiguity, by anyone living within reach of the Tigris River, downstream of the structure. Not everyone accepted that warning at face value, and this is where the story gets genuinely complicated rather than simply alarming. Iraqi officials and some of the engineers working directly on the dam pushed back publicly against the American assessment, arguing that the warning was overstated and politically convenient, arriving at a moment when the United States was pressing for continued access and influence over Iraqi infrastructure projects. Iraqi government representatives stated that they had seen no tangible evidence the dam was on the verge of collapse, and that the structure, while genuinely fragile, was being actively managed rather than silently failing. It's a legitimate and important tension running underneath this entire story, an outside assessment predicting catastrophe, and the officials actually responsible for the structure insisting the situation, while serious, wasn't quite the ticking clock it was being portrayed as. Both sides had genuine incentives shaping their positions, and both sides were, in a sense, correct about different parts of the same problem. The geology really was dissolving. The grouting really was, mostly, keeping pace. Whether that balance would hold indefinitely was the one question nobody could actually answer with certainty. Nasrat Adamo, one of the dam's former chief engineers, offered a characteristically blunt assessment of the uncertainty everyone was grappling with. Nobody could say precisely when the structure might fail, only that failure remained genuinely possible, whether that meant years from now or considerably sooner. That kind of statement, coming from someone who had spent his career intimately familiar with the dam's condition, carried a different weight than either the alarmed American warnings or the more measured Iraqi government reassurances. It suggested the truth sat somewhere in the uncomfortable middle, real, ongoing danger, without a clear timeline attached to it, which is arguably a harder thing for the public to process than either a confirmed emergency or a confirmed all clear. Beyond the staggering human toll at stake, there's a layer of loss to this story that rarely makes it into the headlines. The flood path below Mosul Dam runs directly through some of the most historically significant territory on Earth, including the site of ancient Nineveh, once the largest city in the world during the height of the Assyrian Empire. Archaeologists and historians have pointed out, with a mixture of professional concern and genuine anguish, that a catastrophic dam failure wouldn't just kill people, it would erase physical evidence of human civilization stretching back thousands of years, sites that had already suffered extensive deliberate destruction at the hands of the Islamic State during their occupation of the region. For researchers who had spent careers documenting and protecting that heritage, the prospect of losing it entirely to a flood felt like watching two different kinds of destruction converge on the same irreplaceable history. Nineveh alone once contained palace complexes, ancient city walls, and artifacts dating back nearly 3,000 years, remnants of a civilization that had dominated the entire region long before Rome or Athens rose to prominence. A flood of the scale described in official warnings wouldn't simply damage these sites gradually, the way erosion or looting typically does over decades. It would submerge entire excavation areas under fast-moving water, carrying enormous destructive force, potentially scouring away, in a matter of hours, what archaeologists had spent generations carefully uncovering and documenting. In the years following that 2016 warning, international partners stepped in to help stabilize the situation. Most notably, an Italian engineering firm contracted to lead a major repair and reinforcement effort at the site. That contract, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, brought in specialized equipment and personnel specifically trained for the unusual demands of grouting on this scale, effectively professionalizing an effort that had previously relied heavily on whatever resources the Iraqi government could muster under increasingly difficult circumstances. Grouting operations resumed at a more consistent pace, monitoring equipment was upgraded, and the acute sense of imminent crisis that had defined 2014 through 2016 gradually eased. But easing a crisis isn't the same as solving the underlying problem, and nobody involved in maintaining Mosul Dam claims otherwise. The geological flaw baked into its foundation on the day it was built has never gone away, because it simply can't. You cannot re-engineer the layer of bedrock an entire dam is sitting on top of without essentially building a different dam somewhere else entirely. Think about what that actually means for a structure holding back water above a city of well over 1 million people. There is no future point at which Mosul Dam becomes permanently safe in the way most infrastructure eventually does once repairs are complete. There's no final fix waiting on the other side of enough investment or enough time. The only thing keeping the structure standing is the uninterrupted continuation of exactly the same grouting process that began not long after the dam first opened, decades ago. A process that depends entirely on stable funding, a secure region, and a workforce willing to keep showing up to fight the same battle against dissolving rock, day after day, indefinitely. Every government that has overseen this dam since 1984, through war, sanctions, occupation, insurgency, and fragile reconstruction, has inherited the exact same unsolvable obligation: keep the grout flowing, or risk everything downstream. There is no administration, no political transition, no change in leadership that makes that underlying responsibility go away. It simply gets handed off, again and again, to whoever holds power in Baghdad next. There's a particular kind of engineering story that doesn't resolve the way most disaster narratives do, and this is exactly that kind. There was no single dramatic collapse to point to, no clean before and after moment separating triumph from failure. Instead, there's just an ongoing, unglamorous, absolutely essential maintenance operation that has run for nearly 4 decades, occasionally interrupted by war, funding gaps, and political disputes, but never for long enough to let the underlying threat fully catch up. It's a strange kind of stability, one built not on the absence of danger, but on a permanent, exhausting effort to hold that danger exactly at bay. Compare that to almost any other major engineering disaster people are used to hearing about: a bridge that snaps, a dam that bursts in a single dramatic moment, captured on camera, a building that comes down in seconds. Those stories have a clear beginning, middle, and end. Mosul Dam refuses to offer that same narrative shape, because the crisis it represents was never a single event waiting to happen. It's a permanent condition, an ongoing negotiation between human effort and geological reality that started decades ago and, as far as anyone can currently tell, has no scheduled end date at all. So is Mosul Dam a disaster waiting to happen, or a genuine engineering success story, quietly managing an impossible geological problem for 40 straight years without a single catastrophic failure? Both descriptions are true at the same time, and that tension is really the entire point. As you're watching this right now, somewhere north of Mosul, crews are almost certainly still down in those boreholes, pumping grout into rock that's still slowly dissolving beneath one of the largest reservoirs on Earth, holding back a wave that has never actually arrived, but that nobody has ever been able to promise won't. The dam isn't a ticking time bomb with a countdown you can watch approach zero. It's something quieter and, in its own way, more unsettling than that. A threat with no clock at all, being held off one truckload of cement at a time, today and every day after this one. Right now, while you're watching this, that reality hasn't changed. The dam is still standing. The grout is still being pumped. The dissolving rock beneath it hasn't paused to wait for a permanent solution that, honestly, may never arrive. Somewhere north of Mosul, that quiet, unglamorous work is happening again today, exactly as it has almost every day since 1986, and exactly as it likely will tomorrow, because stopping was never actually an option anyone has ever had.